So, welcome back, everybody, to episode number 10 of the Untangling Election 2021 podcast, your semi-weekly podcast keeping track of the 2021 Canadian federal election. Tonight, about half an hour ago, the first official French language debate finished, and I had the pleasure of sitting in, watching it together with Yussef and Drake, two of my friends, and we're going to give our reactions. Basically, Blanchette attacked, Singh spoke, Trudeau defended, O'Toole commented, and Paul was present. What we're going to be talking about today is what were the issues, how do we think the candidates did, and how will this affect the election campaign? As I alluded to, I'm joined today by two of my friends, and you might have heard them before from previous episodes, Yussef and Drake. Today I'm actually going to introduce myself first because I always forget to do that, and I feel like half the people don't even know who I am, which is great because, I live in the shadows. But regardless, my name's Simon. I'm a 24-year-old recent graduate, did a master's in international relations. I've studied politics all my life, did my undergrad in political science at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and always been fascinated by politics in this election. So this debate, the one we just finished off, you can tell I'm a bit of a high by how quickly I'm speaking. The tension's really pouring, so I'm eager to get started. Drake, do you share my excitement? Where are you from? Who are you?
Oh, I definitely do. I'm Drake. I'm a 23-year-old software developer, and I use he, him pronouns. This has been my fourth election that I've been very excitedly following. Debates are some of my favorite thing to have with friends. I know that makes me super popular with friends. And so just election debates with the leaders, it's always about what are they going to talk about, who's attacking, who's defending. I love it.
Yeah. And Yussef, finally, who are you?
Hi, I'm Yussef, 23 as well, and a recent graduate from Waterloo. Yeah, I've really enjoyed this debate and very excited to talk about it.
Yeah, and the reason I got Yussef and Drake on together is for a few reasons, semi-interconnected for all of them. First of all three of us were somewhat founding members of the University of Waterloo Model Parliament experience, which is the premier parliament experience that the University of Waterloo has ever seen. But moreover, Yussef is a bit more ideologically right-leaning than Drake, who is a bit more ideologically left-leaning, if I can make that generalization. So it'd be interesting to see how the different perspectives kind of view this debate and, I guess, the opinions coming off of that. I guess talking about our opinions of the debate, what are our first impressions? I mean, we just finished the debate. What impressions are left in your mind?
Underwhelming is the first word that comes to mind. And I think it's worth saying that I am not fluent enough in French, so I was listening to the English translation version of the debate, and that definitely had some impact on how I took in this debate. But generally, I felt that there were very few moments of any kind of heated, passionate arguing, and there wasn't really anything surprising. They largely said what we already knew. I don't think any new ground was really broken on any particular issue tonight.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think Yusuf, you're also talking about that as we were going through it, about how there's just a general, I guess, kind of lack of an emotion present. I know you listen to it in your native French tongue, right? So how do you think about it?
Yeah, I was unsurprised as well. A lot of what they said came out of their platforms. Overall, a lot of the positions seemed very well known before, and a lot of the attacking points we kind of saw coming as well. In the other French debate, they attacked essentially the same issues, and this is kind of what they've been going on in the press. Everyone's language skills were kind of to be as expected as well. Blanchette had his little condescending French, and Trudeau's French was great as always. I was very surprised at how well spoken Anime Paul was, and Aaron O'Toole kind of sounded like he was reading from a French class. So
Yeah. Do we think that maybe the lack of excitement we got from this debate is maybe indicative of something? Or why do we think wasn't as much excitement? Maybe because the platforms were a bit more boring. Maybe this election just isn't as exciting. Or what are our pet theories about this?
I think it was because it seemed on many issues everyone just agreed, but kind of had different approaches. And actually, in a lot of cases, they were essentially the same approaches. I know when it came to environmental policy, everyone intends on trying to hit a carbon reduction target. Everyone has some form of plan, unlike other elections. When it came to health, I know Aaron O'Toole, which as some background, I am conservative, so I paid a bit more attention to him. He liked to emphasize that there's no strings attached to the money. Um, but overall, it sounded like everyone had very similar policies.
Yeah, because I distinctly remember, this was kind of highlighted in the first few minutes, I think under the health section, where the moderator tried to pit Blanchette and Paul against each other on the topic of vaccinations, I believe. And basically they were like, what are we arguing about? We both kind of had the same perspective here.
It was
So it's kind
Paul
of
and
funny.
Ting, but yeah.
Oh, my bad. But yeah, no, Drake, go on though. Do you agree with this assessment of Yussef's?
Yeah, generally there didn't seem to be that many wedge issues in this election as there have been in prior elections. The Conservatives have a somewhat credible environmental plan, unlike the last election. So that is a relief and a huge positive step. The merits of it, I'm sure, can be litigated over for hours, and hopefully we'll try and avoid that. But really, the only wedge issues that Justin Trudeau has managed to find has been somewhat mandatory vaccinations, but even then, we're pretty much building consensus. And then, surprisingly, this seems to be an election about, automatic weapons and handguns in Canada, which, if you'd asked me what the biggest issues that were going to be wedges in this election would have been, I would not have pegged that.
Yeah, I see that Trudeau was really looking for a wedge issue, like anywhere he could find it, and he finally kind of landed on something with handguns. I remember at the beginning of the campaign, he tried abortion, was not able to do that. I think he tried healthcare, was not able to do that. Vaccines, not very successful, and then kind of landed on handguns, and it just seems like he's trying to find something that he can do a soundbite and, have something that is significantly different from the Conservatives.
Good points. I also want to, I guess, kind of start us off, because I know we're going to get into some of the more substantive parts in a second. But I was just thinking off the bat, was there anybody who really kind of disappointed you in their performance in the debate? And I guess for me personally, I'll take the jump again because I'm a bit excited. I thought Singh was kind of underwhelming, because when you were mentioning wedge issues, Yussef, his full thing was cost of living and affordability, and that barely played into the narrative of all that we saw him preach about in the debates. Most of the stuff he was talking about was just attacks on Trudeau. So I thought that wasn't maybe the best showing he had, but then again, it is in Quebec, which isn't his prime audience, so to say.
If I'm being honest, I don't think I was blown away by any particular leader for most of the debate. Nothing unexpected. I found that it was quite lacking in substance. In a lot of cases, they weren't even necessarily talking about their various platform policy planks. They would just say, we need to do this. And I have read a lot of analyses about all the different party platforms. So I'm pretty familiar and I would know what's coming behind that. But I don't think the average Canadian listening in saying, we need to do more on long-term care would be able to glean when the different leaders say that, what they actually want to do. They were just like, we need to do this. But there was no follow through a lot of the time I found on, okay, so what are you going to do? Because there are differences.
Yeah.
I think I was honestly very disappointed with the Indigenous issues. I saw that was one of their main sections, and they addressed maybe two things for 5 minutes, and they didn't really get into anything more than like the very broad strokes of it, especially given that this is a pretty serious issue at this time and a very public issue. I was surprised that they didn't go more into it.
Yeah, and I think it's nice that we're kind of transitioning into the issues of debate, because what I kind of want to structure this podcast as from now on, I want to go and progress through each section of the debate and then kind of talk about what our thoughts were in a section, who kind of stood out, who kind of didn't perform as well as we expected, and kind of give our final thoughts on that. So for my notes, there are about 5 main sections, which consisted of healthcare, I believe, labor, the environment, Indigenous identity and culture, and finally, justice and foreign affairs. So we'll kind of proceed for those 5 categories and kind of give our thoughts on what happened during the time there. So let's start at the beginning of the debate, which was now about 2-3 hours ago. But what do we think about the healthcare section?
If I'm being honest, I found it somewhat difficult to stay fully focused because I found that there was no real contrasting of differences in platforms. Generally, all the leaders except O'Toole support mandatory vaccination, and O'Toole is pretty close. I think it's a losing issue. The majority of Canadians support mandatory vaccinations, and O'Toole's position is trying to thread a needle that generally most Canadians just flat out support mandatory vaccinations, vaccine passports, those things. but largely it didn't seem like there was anything new. There weren't a whole lot of substantive details that were talked about, in my opinion.
Yeah, the biggest thing, honestly, was the bigger issue that I kept seeing them talk about was how much money they're going to be funding towards Quebec specifically and the provinces for healthcare. And they specifically spent some time going around the table and making every leader answer how much money to be funneling there. And it was kind of telling to me that only two leaders really was able to form a distinct response to this question. I think they started with seeing Paul and Blanchette, and both of those kind of fumbled around with that. Whereas later on, Trudeau and O'Toole were the only ones who could really definitively state the numbers they were saying. What were your impressions, Yussef? Were you as not impressed as Drake?
Yeah, I do like that Trudeau finally has a position on how much money he will give for healthcare transfers. But I was unimpressed that the other three leaders didn't really have a number that they landed on. But more specifically, last election we had like the issue of pharmacare and dental care, and these things weren't even mentioned in this debate, the previous French debate, and these would have been issues that I think would have been interesting to hear discussed further, and especially given the pandemic and the public light shined on healthcare, it would have been a good time to discuss it. Additionally, Aaron O'Toole is very big on mental health care, and I'm surprised we didn't really hear much about that.
For sure. The topic really squarely focused, as much as it was a healthcare section, they spent a lot of time mostly talking about the pandemic, mandatory vaccines, which, as we said, there's a lot of similarities there. There's not a whole lot of differences. And then they closed the section flat out just saying, would you give the provinces the $28 billion in healthcare transfers that they want? Aaron O'Toole, yes, no strings attached. Blanchette, of course he wants to give the provinces more money. Justin Trudeau says he wants to give them $25 billion. Now, he didn't specify, but I think that number isn't a no strings attached amount. I think that is the collection of money he wants to give the provinces, but for specific purposes, which we know how much the provinces like being dictated what to do. Jagmeet Singh had the awkward response to a yes or no question by saying, we'll increase them, and that's all he said. And Annemie Paul also said yes. So that would appear to be that 3 of the 5 leaders supported $28 billion going to the provinces, potentially no strings attached.
Yeah, it was definitely a weird way to round the section out, and there was a pretty abrupt transition to the labor section as well. But I guess final thoughts on this section. Did anybody stand out to you in particular from the leaders there?
No, no one really stood out, I would say. Everyone said they would increase it, or everyone said they would spend it, essentially.
I will say, personally, I thought what stood out to me was how decent Trudeau kind of did. I expected him to get slaughtered on some of these issues, and he didn't get that many hardballs thrown at him, and he seemed to be pretty amicable. And I feel like if I was a Quebecer, as I'm allowed to call myself now, I guess, I would maybe bat another eye towards Trudeau.
For sure. I think you could summarize this section as let's vaccinate as many people as possible and spend more money in healthcare. There's differences, but that's really what I would say it boiled down to. We didn't get into the minutia of the different positions.
Yeah. And I guess that's where we'll leave it as well, because I guess we have a few more sections to get through in a finite amount of time. So our next section was on labor. And most of this section on labor seemed not to focus specifically on labor, but rather pandemic recovery, where it was all about how the CERB was to be implemented if it was to be remained, how the leaders were going to create more jobs and make sure people were employed. And this was a really interesting section for me too, because most leaders, again, they just stuck to some of their platform points and didn't specify anything. Drake, do you want to maybe take the ball on this? Tell us about how this kind of ran.
Sure. So I was taking notes, and I believe every single leader basically said use training,
Yes.
job skills, and they all talked about working cooperatively/collaboratively, governments, education institutions, and businesses. They basically all said that in some form of another. There was interesting talk about CERB and how CERB was potentially making the labor shortage worse. The bloc leader wants to eliminate CERB, or technically he used the word suspend CERB, for everyone except people working in arts and culture. Trudeau didn't think that was necessary because they've already cut it back to less than minimum wage now for the people still on CERB. Annemie Paul and Jagmeet Singh both support continuing and possibly increasing that, because they say there are more people, particularly marginalized communities, that are still very reliant on these benefits. And Aaron O'Toole was also talking about CERB and how it could be contributing to the labor shortage, although I didn't pick up on what specifically he would do. Maybe you caught that, Yussef.
Yeah, he essentially mentioned the same thing as everyone else: immigration, collaboration, all those points to address the labor shortage. He did mention specifically Serb's contribution in his opinion to the labor shortage. I was actually very interested to hear Anime Paul use like the term universal basic income and address that. It might not be a policy I particularly support, but having a conversation about it, I think, is a good thing to have in a debate. And I wish that they actually had discussed it more, because it is an interesting policy. And given the use of CERB over the last year is relevant in regards to policy ideas.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Yusuf, because I remember I, I feel like Enemy Paul, when she was talking about CERB, expected to get more in a debate about it, because she made some allusions towards other candidates, including probably Singh also being in support of it, but the moderator just didn't want to go in that direction, it seemed, and we quickly moved on to a different area, inflation, which we'll move on to in a second. But yeah, no, Labour seemed pretty much the same thing. I think the only leader which stood out to me again, and I don't want to sound like too much of a liberal fanboy, which I'm not to emphasize, was Trudeau again, because he was the only one who brought something different with saying the hiring benefit thing, which I don't know the details of too much, but it just stood out to me as something different than what the others were saying.
Actually, Aaron O'Toole has essentially the same policy
Oh, my
where
bad.
he plans on funding up to 50%. It's like between 25 to 50% of new employees' salaries. I think it's for either 3 months or 6 months after they're hired, depending on how long they were unemployed before that. And essentially, it's kind of a continuation of the Canadian wage supplement.
The issue is he didn't really make that known during the debates. I don't think I caught that from him too
No, he
vividly.
didn't. And I was surprised that he didn't mention that, because this was a pretty well laid out policy within his
Yeah,
platform, and it was like towards the beginning of it. And again, it would have been a great thing to discuss in the debate. Another idea that could have been very useful to have a conversation about, and for some reason, we're not just they weren't discussing these things.
Absolutely. And I think it would be remiss to forget that daycare was also at the very end. That was the open debate for this section. Although, really, there's not a whole lot of difference there. Both the Liberals and the NDP want to continue on the $10 a day daycare. That comes from the NDP's platform under Mulcair in 2015. Of course, the Liberals have already signed deals for that. The Bloc loves it because they already have a daycare plan, so the federal government's just going to cut them a check. Aaron O'Toole really only stands out because he does not want to do that. And it was very interesting to see the moderators press O'Toole, in part because cutting up that deal of funding would be several $billion not going to the Quebec government. And it just, maybe it's because it's my first French debate that I've watched before, but it felt very bizarre, that fixation about, like, it's not just Quebec that would be losing out on money. They've signed deals with every province but Alberta and Ontario for this $10 a day childcare. But they focused on the fact that it would be Quebec losing out on billions of dollars. And how did Aaron O'Toole feel about that? He has a different plan. I don't think we're looking to get into the merits and the differences there. But it was interesting that that's where the moderators seemed to be trying to push the conversation, because otherwise he was the only one disagreeing on the field of the leaders. Everyone else is like, yep, $10 a day daycare. Let's do it.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting, because I think it comes back to the whole French debate as a whole. The concentration of Quebec, I feel like we might as well call it the Quebec debate instead of the French debate. There's still the fact that there are many Francophone people who live outside of Quebec. There's a large Acadian population. There's a large Francophone population in Ontario. And so these issues affect all of them. And they're having a debate in their main language that seems to be centered around non-Quebecers.
yeah, I agree. I thought the daycare section was one that really stood out to me. And from that section, I feel like you saw most prominently the divide between the liberal-minded parties, which were most of them, and then the conservatives. And I guess it
Yeah.
also led to like the one really pressing quote by Paul, which was that, oh, let the women speak here because it's an issue that affects women the most. I thought that was an important point to really have that recognition that she is the only female leader at this point on that stage, and we didn't see any recognition of that until at least half an hour in debate was kind of startling to me. So,
well, and they
true.
didn't allow her to speak in the debate. They kept talking over, and so that was her way of forcing her way into the, hey, I'm a leader on this stage. I'm also a woman with children. Maybe I should also speak on this daycare issue. And I also caught that she referred to daycare as a right, which I think kind of slipped under the radar, but is a very interesting way of looking at the issue.
Yeah.
And I think she did mention like how this actually affects women instead of looking at this as like a way to score political points like the rest of them do. She mentioned the real world benefits that these policies would actually have. And then they, of course, interrupt her.
I will say, though, that despite us being pretty favorably to Paul right now, what I did think most of the time when she was speaking, not even in this section, but other ones too, she kept making good points, but didn't really refer back to anything. I just felt like she was mentioning stuff that didn't seem to really... She couldn't say, this is our policy that will fix it. She'll just say, oh, this is a good idea. And I think that's the main issue, because it just shows a lack of action being proposed by the Green Party. But we'll get into that more, I think, especially in the environment section, which really stood out to me. But
yeah, I feel like it's important to say the Conservatives do have a childcare plan. They do intend on supporting childcare for low-income individuals. I feel like that needed to be said as well.
Absolutely, and they just have a different idea than pretty much the other parties. So they stood alone on that stage on that issue for the most part.
Yeah. Moving on now to the environment, which is another area which traditionally the Conservatives have stood alone on in the last few years. But this time, they joined the rest of the crowd. Yussef, do you want to kick us off by how this section went?
I am actually fairly impressed with their environment plan. I do realize that even though Aaron O'Toole has said that he plans on following the Paris Agreement, unfortunately, by going back to Harper's original target, he's no longer following the agreement, since it stipulates that you can't decrease a target after you've announced an increased target. But when it actually comes to a plan for decreasing carbon emissions, I would obviously pivot more towards what he has planned in his platform.
But I do have to say, I noticed during the debate, Yussef, he didn't make much reference to this plan at all. And I think that's why being a bit more defensive about that the plan does exist. Because I think, as Drake was saying earlier, it's all about just technology and environment. He didn't really make any reference to any specific goals. What did you think about that performance?
Yeah, when it actually came to what he said in the debate, it wasn't much. He had mentioned green vehicles, industry emissions, and technology. I would say that it appears Trudeau was kind of wishy-washy on whether he will approve future pipelines, and that was a partial discussion among the other leaders as well. And I'm sure Drake has some good points along those lines.
Drake is our former Green member here, so.
Yes, and what I value most of all when it comes to environmental plans is pragmatism, and of course recognizing the severity in which we need to act. So what I caught from the environmental segment was, I think it's just going to be a recurring theme of disappointment that these parties have very different plans. They all do. And we didn't really get that. Aaron O'Toole talked a lot about technology. He has a plan. It's not my favorite plan. I don't think that is a secret based on how I speak, but he has a plan. All he really talked about for some reason was technology and sequestration and that kind of thing, which is great, but that's not his entire plan. So he's kind of missing. He made one reference to his plan for basically the carbon tax money that you pay goes into a personal account that you spend out of. And at one point he was pressed by the moderator about that plan means that the more you burn in carbon, the more you have in that account to spend. He didn't really handle that question very well, in my opinion. But that's really all that came up for that part of the plan. At no point did he really flesh out even why that would work. But I also don't think any of the other parties really talked much about their platforms and how they differ. It was somewhat referenced, but in the Green platform that released 2 days ago, they're basically talking about ending the oil and gas sector in Canada quite quickly. I know that platform came out 2 days ago, but that's a huge statement to make in the country of Canada, and I'm surprised that wasn't raised for Annamie Paul to talk about. They all have different numbers of emission targets that they want to hit. They even spelled out the moderators at the end. Conservatives are aiming for 30%, Liberals 40%, Bloc, NDP 50%, Greens 60%. But at no point did they talk about why those targets are different and, why does it need to be 60%? Annamie Paul did no real work to explain why it has to be 60%, and that's why they have credibility. Trudeau didn't explain that 40% is our target, we'll do it. No, at no point did the Bloc or the NDP justify why it needed to be 50% or 50% should be our baseline. There are huge differences, and I'm disappointed that we kind of skirted over them.
To be honest, the only time somebody questioned the targets was when the moderator, I believe, brought up that she heard that the other Green Party members were saying that the current platform wasn't ambitious enough, and she literally said, "Do you want to handle the quote, Drake?"
I don't have the direct quote, but yes, Andrew Weaver, the former leader of the Green Party of British Columbia and a climate scientist, last week endorsed the Liberal Party environment plan, which is huge. And so the moderator basically asked Annamie Paul, is there a reason for your party to still exist?
And that was pretty much verbatim. It was pretty insane.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, it's a good question, given the current turmoil within the party, given the shift of all the parties to the left. It seems like some of the other parties are trying to get into the area of the Green Party, and even one of the Green Party members have now left the party.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get more into that in a second, but yeah. And I will also say, I guess, rounding out this segment pretty much, whose name did we not mention at all in the last 20 minutes?
He's Francois Blanchet.
No, Singh.
Oh.
And that's kind of my point. I felt he was very absent. During the environment thing, the main few points he made was calling out Trudeau for not having accomplished anything in 6 years, and then also calling out Trudeau for not being ambitious enough. Beyond that, I understood he had climate targets which were similar to the Green Party and the Liberal Party, but I saw no real substantive, even less than the other parties, coming from him.
That's actually, I'm looking over my notes now, and what I have written down the few times he spoke was he would eliminate oil and gas subsidies. They would do it immediately. Liberals would do it 2 years earlier than they had originally said, so in 2 years. And then his main point that he hammered on was that we have the worst record of any G7 country, and that Trudeau has done nothing in the last 6 years, which is a weird claim to unpack because our emissions have risen ever so slightly, but the last year we have data for is 2019, and we know in 2020 that's going to be a pretty big drop driven by COVID and the economic contraction that came with it. But the PBO has said with the current slate of policies in effect, we are already on a pretty decent course to at least hit 30% reduction by 2030. So it's an interesting thing where they are correct that emissions have risen under Trudeau, but we are in a better position now to see our emissions start falling with these things in place. A carbon tax does not immediately have an effect on emissions immediately.
Yeah. And final point before we move on from climate. Drake, I remember you laughed at this pretty hard. Do you remember what Blanchet's response was to the Trans Mountain Pipeline?
No, I don't actually.
Yussef, you're smiling.
I forget.
Basically, he said he was going to give it to the Albertans.
Right, I can't believe I forgot that. I can't believe. Yeah, he wants to give the pipeline to Albertans to pay for their just transition away from the oil and gas sector. Which, I mean, what a progressive policy. And that does remind me, he did say that Quebec would subsidize Alberta for them to transition away from oil and gas,
which is big.
Which is big because that's not money coming into Quebec, so I'm surprised he would support such a policy.
I mean, regardless, I guess we're pretty much done with the environment. Any final points you wanted to make as well, Yussef? Or
I would say that I do remember them mentioning, as a nation of oil exporters, generally, it's good that we have some form of a climate plan, but we still are pretty behind our partners. And these are like important, at least debates to have in order to get in line with our G7 partners.
Yeah, but I guess the overall sentiment is that that little kid they had in the beginning must be pretty disappointed about his future.
Yeah, the fact that they had a little kid ask the question that opens it was
Yeah,
brilliant.
it really was.
I guess moving on to our penultimate section, which they talked about, which we were so disappointed about. I think we even like tuned out for half of it because it just trailed off. But anyway, it was on Indigenous identity and culture issues. Do you want to hit it off, Yussef, with your disappointed look?
Well, I know I mentioned this before, but I was very disappointed in this section. It's a very hot topic issue at the moment, specifically with residential schools, and I don't think that they were mentioned or discussed
I don't think
among
so
the
either.
leaders. This is very surprising. I know Aaron O'Toole mentioned the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Council, but overall, no one really discussed the main issues. They did discuss Indigenous languages, and O'Toole mentioned addition of Indigenous language services, which is good. I didn't hear any specific policies from the other leaders, except for a general, I will like to add Indigenous languages to the Primary Languages of Canada by Blanchette. But
Yeah.
overall, they could have discussed a lot more, and I'm surprised that they didn't.
Yeah, and part of it, I think, before I let Drake speak, because he wanted to mention something on, make a correction on your part, Yusuf. But regardless, part of the issue is simply that they put three kind of very different and loaded topics together in one: Indigenous identity and culture, which are all thrown together, which include such broad aspects as all these Indigenous issues, which on its own should have been like an hour-long segment in some circumstances, as well as other stuff like, taxing mega corporations, I think was also mentioned, as well as
Mm-hmm.
ensuring like the CBC survives or hosting public stuff. So it was just kind of disappointing that a lot of the time we could have spent talking about Indigenous issues, which mattered a lot to Canadians, was instead allocated for more cultural services. But sorry, go on, Drake.
Yes, and I want to specify that the part of the debate that we just tuned out was on culture and
Yes.
funding for media and arts. That was the part I wanted to make sure that everyone is aware
Yes,
that is
yes.
specifically why for the rest of the segment we were like, they're not talking about Indigenous issues anymore?
Yeah.
Really? They got 5 minutes? All right. They're asking about like funding for the arts, which is cool, but I don't think it places anywhere in our top list of priorities for the three of us as a country.
I mean, as a
Yeah.
philosophy major, but
Of course.
no, sorry.
And they completely went over the water advisories. Like they generally mentioned it's bad we still have water advisories, but no one really mentioned how they're going to end the water advisories. No one specifically mentioned a timeline to end the water advisories. Trudeau said that there is a plan in place and he's working on it, but nothing more than that. The fact that we have water advisories in a G7 country is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And, there should have been plans discussed.
Absolutely.
Go ahead,
It's
Drake.
at this point I should possibly state that I am myself Indigenous, so that does color how I see this issue. And it was interesting that how they opened it when we were talking about languages is the question was from an Indigenous person asking if each leader would commit to recognizing Indigenous languages as official languages of Canada. It wasn't clear, and I think it might be in part because I was listening to English translations, if that meant amending the Official Languages Act of Canada, and that would mean that, you'd have to speak, or not have to speak, but services would have to be in all of these languages as part of that. It wasn't clear, but every leader, excluding Aaron O'Toole, said yes at some point. The Bloc leader started off, and he occupies this interesting space where, because he views so strongly that Quebec is its own nation, historically through his leadership of the Bloc, he's also really been empathetic to Indigenous people and recognizes them as nations as well, and was supportive of recognizing their language rights, because in majority of the country, French is a minority language. And so it's nice that he is consistent there. It was interesting that O'Toole was pressed about would he recognize Indigenous languages and make them official languages, and his response was he would be open to the possibility of having services delivered in Indigenous languages. And that's as far as he was willing to go, it's different. The other leaders all at some point said that they would do it. There also were people referencing that they would follow all calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Aaron O'Toole, to his credit, did bring that up. Yeah, and then moving on to the water advisories, because you jumped there, Yussef. It is a very complicated issue in that, and I don't want to come off as a liberal fanboy because they have made terrible mistakes and they are taking Indigenous kids to court over a settlement issue. And the fact that that issue wasn't raised, and the fact that Indigenous kids receive 70% of what any other kid in Canada gets in terms of services, huge issue that wasn't raised. And that was disappointing that wasn't even a topic of conversation, because the Canadian government is actively taking these kids to court to appeal a human rights tribunal decision. But on water advisories, the Liberal government is giving each individual band that is under a water advisory control of, do they go for a short or long-term project, and when they choose to lift the water advisory. So there are some communities that have chosen short-term projects to fix the problem, but that have kept that in place, the water advisory, until there can be a long-term. The Trudeau government has still taken far too long on it, but I do think that, other than just saying that it is atrocious, and it is atrocious that as a G7 country, there are communities under boil water advisories in some places for years on end, I did miss some of the nuances. And like you said, Yussef, no one really talked about a plan.
Honestly, we've spent longer now talking only about your boil water advisories than probably the entire Indigenous section.
Yes.
Which is sad.
I'm so sorry, but also I'm not sorry.
Yussef, sorry, you had a point.
So Trudeau didn't actually say that he would have Indigenous languages as official languages.
Yeah, he also was kind of coy about it.
That's true.
Like he 100% did not say he intends on having them as official languages. Like, he very much dodged it, and the intention was that he does not intend on.
He did bring up Mary
as
Simon
official
speaking
languages.
Inuktitut.
I
Yes,
think so.
but
Yeah, I'll grant you that. He also
100%
dodged.
has no intention of adding any additional official languages. Like, that was very clear. I feel like I should outline that.
Getting in your conservative hit points here, I see. But
I'm sorry, I had to.
No, it's fair. I glossed over that. I did.
And to be honest, this might be simply an area where Trudeau's French abilities kind of outshine O'Toole's. But yeah. One other point I want to say. We tuned out for part of the culture segment, and when we turned back, they were talking about burning books. Do we want to...
They talked more about burning books than they did water advisories.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
Drake,
did.
You searched up the news story. Do you want to illuminate what this section was about?
So, yes, because we tuned back in. We were all sitting on a call watching this debate. And so, reported in the National Post a day ago, that's the article I found, there was a book burning held by an Ontario Francophone school board as an act of reconciliation with Indigenous people. And they burned several thousand books, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, I had no idea this happened.
Nope, strike that. That wasn't true. They burned...
several
right,
books.
Okay.
2 books,
They
to be
burned
exact.
30 books.
That's nothing.
For educational purposes, and then the ashes were used as fertilizer to plant a tree. And that was a very interesting issue to come up with. The school board has since apologized, but it feels weird that they focused on book burning, as Yussef said, for a longer amount of time than boil water advisories.
Yeah. Anyways, I guess we should end our own section here, not to cut the Indigenous issue short like our French counterparts. But one final thing. They also covered culture, and probably the most heated moment during the entire debate happened here, where Trudeau and Blanchet got in a heated fight about Trudeau defending his own ability and his own status as a Quebecer and his own ability to represent French Canadians. Do any one of you two want to highlight that?
Yeah, I mean, as much as I might not like Trudeau in other areas, like he's Quebecois, he's Francophone, and then like Blanchet kind of attacks him on this, which is very surprising. And I was happy to see a spirited response by Trudeau, defending himself on this. And it really put Blanchet in his place.
I think so too. He really got, to use a crude language, he got his ass kicked there. I thought so.
For sure. And it was nice to see Trudeau he did tell Blanchet that he is not the representative for all of Quebec. The Liberals have seats there too. So do the Conservatives. Well, he didn't talk about the Conservatives having seats there, but pushing back on the fact that only the Bloc can represent Quebec interests, which of course the Bloc wants to be the only party to represent Quebec interests so that they can win all of the seats. But it was probably one of the best exchanges in the debate for seeing actual passion come through.
Yeah. Let's move on to the final section they talked about. So the fifth section on justice and foreign affairs, which was interesting because I think the English language debate is actually not even covering foreign affairs, which as an international relations student makes me kind of sad. But regardless, the majority of this section is a scathing set of questions asked on foreign affairs by a guest. So do we want to talk about any of those issues?
For sure. Maybe I'll take the opening one, which was a question asked about Afghanistan and the people that were left behind. And it was a Canadian who asked this question who had family who supported the Canadian military before they became Canadian citizens and lost their lives helping being translators, interpreters for the Canadian military. So it was a very sombering moment. And she asked what each leader would do to get the rest of Canadian nationals and allies out of Afghanistan, which is a very messy situation. And it's also a very difficult thing to offer any kind of concrete plans. I felt that Blanchet was the most truthful when he said that we need to recognize that we are not a huge international power and we can only really act with our partners and allies. And so no leader came out and said that we are going to send in troops and get these people out because that's not practical. It did seem that, and this was a recurring theme during the debate, whenever you're not entirely sure how to respond to a question, you would just say, well, what I would have done was not call an election so I could focus on this issue. It was a recurring thing throughout the debate. And I think Annamie Paul and Jagmeet Singh both raised it. And I think Aaron O'Toole might have also talked about not having called an election in this section as well.
Yeah, I think the latter half of the section too. I'll cover some of the foreign policy stuff because the woman who gave the questions was scathing to the parties. So first of all, each candidate got a different question tailored for them, which I thought was kind of nice. So Blanchet was asked specifically on his policies of prioritizing French-speaking immigrants to coming to Canada, which he defended fairly well. So I think he actually handled this section the best. Then she moved to Singh, and she asked, you have almost no foreign policy whatsoever in your plan. As a leader of a G7 nation, how would you react? And he kind of stumbled his way, saying he'd focus on economic development, and she quickly batted out away and made him look kind of foolish. Then she moved on to Trudeau, and she literally told him, you've had 3 phone calls with Biden during your time handling the COVID-19 response. What's up with that? And Trudeau was also... he ended up being like, oh, well, relations are good between us. They're extremely good. And then she kind of cut him off and moved on to the next one. So she took like 3 for free there. Then she went on to Paul. And this was very, very brutal. And she directly asked her about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and where her personal views were on that. Which, if you've listened to our Green Party episode with Drake, you know that this is a bit of a touchy issue for the Green Party right now. And much to, I think, the Green Party supporters... discussed, or if that's not too strong a word, Annamie Paul refused to make any statements on that part, saying people have different opinions. Whereas my personal opinion, I think it might have been nice for her to come out perhaps with something of a reconciliation out of that fiasco that happened. And then finally, O'Toole had his chance to really maybe get the only victory here, and he stumbled as well because she specifically pressed him on the China issue. And he was like, yeah, we'll put more sanctions on them. We'll be more aggressive. And then she pointed out that Trudeau had already put sanctions and made him look a little bit foolish as well. So any reactions from you guys on this scathing foreign policy section?
Well, Annamie Paul was absolutely savaged. And the fact that she said, basically she doesn't have any of her personal opinions on Israel or Palestine in the party platform. And that's all, that's how she answered the question.
Mm-hmm.
If you could call it that. No, not good enough. I actually thought Aaron O'Toole didn't do too bad on this section. I would almost say I think he was my favorite respondent for this one. Part of her question was like, you want to take a hard line on China. We can't do that alone. And what happens if you try and do that and our allies don't stand with us? He didn't really answer that latter half of the question, and it is a difficult thing to answer with. But I think he made great points. We're the only member of Five Eyes who hasn't explicitly banned Huawei in our 5G networks. That's a thing. Talking about trying to achieve some form of balance in international trade and making sure that our aluminum can be exported to China. And I don't think he was entirely foolish. Yes, Trudeau has put sanctions in place, but referencing the Magnitsky Act and the ability to put additional sanctions in the CCP. And of course, every party leader hammered Justin Trudeau on his entire cabinet being absent when the House voted to recognize the Uyghur genocide. So I thought his performance in this section was probably my favorite and the strongest.
Yussef, any thoughts as well? Because I feel like you were a bit offended when I mentioned that I did not think O'Toole did too well in the China question.
I agree with Drake in that section. Specifically, I'm happy that he mentioned the vote that took place in Parliament. I think it was like a very important vote. I wish maybe they gave Trudeau a chance to address it. That would have been interesting to hear. And that's kind of the unfortunate part of them doing a one-on-one in this section, is they didn't really allow any of the other leaders to address what was being said. Because I think it's also useful to have addressed like maybe what Blanchette said about French prioritization to Quebec, because I'm pretty sure the French language is considered in the point system for immigration
Yes.
as equal to English, which could have been something that was brought up, like would have been brought up by someone else had the question been also put to the group. But Blanchette did make a good point that there's a lot of francophone nations within Africa as well, but I think his stance kind of is at odds with the point system that's already in existence. If you perhaps weight French more than other aspects of the system. But it would have been interesting to hear if maybe he meant it more towards refugee policy, or what specifically he meant by prioritizing French immigration.
Yeah. No, those are good points. And I think we're going to wrap up a more substantive discussion here. And we're going to look now a bit of what we think the impacts and I guess the winners of the debate might have been. So I want to kick us off by really quickly. I don't know if we can do this or if you have any reservations, just let me know. But I'm going to go around and give each of you a really quick minute because we are running low on time to just say, who do you think won debate? Who do you think lost and why? And if nobody won, that's also a valid answer. And I want to know why as well. No, I'll start. So I really want to lean into saying that nobody really won this debate because I didn't see much strong opinions being presented. If I were to press to choose a single individual, I would say Trudeau, simply because he managed to really represent himself as a Quebecer, which I think is most important in the French language debates, as well as not fall victim to many of the more pressing concerns we've had and seen expressed throughout the campaign. As for losers, I'm really between Singh and Annemie Paul, because for Paul, I thought she was very underwhelming, and there were many issues where she was questioned. Like, I think they even questioned whether the Green Party should exist at one point, which probably isn't the best thing to get out of a debate. Moreover, I think Singh simply, I liked the guy. He performed very well at the English language debate in 2019, but we barely mentioned his name at all during here. His contributions were pretty much limited to only attacking Trudeau, which I thought was simply just a strategy to try and lose Trudeau some seats, give him some more influence in case that there is a minority government, and, maybe just lend a hand to the Bloc Québécois. So I would probably say Singh in some senses didn't impress me as well, and I hope he'll turn around in the English language debate. Yussef.
So I guess I might look at this from a slightly different perspective, looking at kind of my expectations. And I think that Trudeau won the debate, mainly because he survived the debate. I remember watching the previous French debate, and there was a lot more attacks on him, and there could have been a lot more attacks on him. I know that his poll numbers are not doing as bad since the previous debate, and I would imagine that they're probably not going to do too bad after this debate either. And I would say that's probably why he might be the winner. He also was able to express some form of policies, and he got some jabs in at other leaders. I might say that Aaron O'Toole was the loser of the debate.
Wow, as a conservative, that's surprising to hear.
Yeah, I don't think he was able to discuss a lot of his platform, and specifically some of like the actual interesting and, in my opinion, good ideas in it. I think he was very limited by his language abilities as well. And generally going in with the expectations I had, I kind of look at him as having lost this one.
Okay. Drake, do you want to do a final segment? Because I think you've been in thought about this.
Yes, I've been thinking about this while you've been speaking. I don't know if I would say Trudeau was the winner, but he definitely did a very good job defending against attacks he knew were coming. They repeatedly kept hitting on the early election call. Throughout the entire debate, every section, every leader kept bringing that up. And that's an issue that's, the Liberals expected wouldn't last as long as it has been. We're halfway through the election and he's still having to take these kinds of attacks. But I thought he handled them reasonably well. I would actually say my number 2 spot would probably go to O'Toole. He didn't get too detailed in his policy, but I thought in this debate, he's basically trying to eat into Bloc support, and he made darn sure on pretty much every issue he would talk about how he would respect provincial jurisdiction, cooperate, collaborate with the government. That was his tagline. I think he probably memorized exactly how to say that in French because he said it so often. And does that impact me as a voter? Not particularly, but I also don't think I was his target as a voter during this debate. And I think he did what he was trying to do well. I put Blanchette in the middle, and I think Paul did worse than Jagmeet Singh insofar as if you're trying to bring voters to the party and really reinvigorate the poll numbers that have been slumping for the Greens, she made great points, and we've mentioned some of the spots where we thought she did well, but I feel like she gave the least amount of detail on the platform, and very seldom were there reasons why, we're better in this regard, vote for us, talked about guaranteed income and things like that. Having to justify why your party exists is a hard question to be given, but you could have also parlayed that into talking about here's our platform we just released 2 days ago, vote for us. And she really didn't. So I think she is the loser, feels strong, the worst performer, I would say, out of this debate. And I don't think she's going to really do much out of this debate to really help her campaign in Toronto Centre or the Greens nationally overall.
Yeah, I think those are some good reflections from us on just how the debate went. Overall, I think we came in saying it was fairly underwhelming, and I think we're going to leave saying it was fairly underwhelming, but we have a great eye on the English language debates that are coming up. And this kind of spills into what I'm going to appropriate as my personal question for today, because it's getting late. I'm going to ask you guys, if you could ask one question to the group of the leaders, what would it be? And we can say this can be any question, including the pre-existing questions or themes we know about. So any one issue you really want to pit them on.
I would ask, how would we be better prepared for the next pandemic?
That's a good question. Do you think that's a specific party would really excel in answering that? Or do you have any expectations if that were to be answered? Or asked, sorry.
I know both the Liberals and the Conservatives have discussed some form of a plan going forward, but I'd be interested to hear how everyone would kind of respond to that.
Yeah.
What about you, Drake?
I would have to come back to what's my important issue, which is the environment. And so I'd probably ask something along the lines of the United Kingdom's goal under Paris is 64% reductions. The United States is doing 50% reductions. How do each of your plans meet the actual call to action of the Paris Climate Accords and the climate crisis that we find ourselves in? And are you content that you are doing the best you can for the future generations on this file?
Do you think that would see any good answers? Because I know Paris Climate Accords did play a role in the French language debate that we just listened to. Do you think you'd get any more substantive answers out of your question? Or maybe you would ask a bit more authoritatively?
I would probably ask it a bit more authoritatively. Really, I'd like to be the person there policing that question to call out when they're skirting the question, because I think it is quite serious.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I would get a very satisfactory answer, but it is the question I feel like I would ask.
I'm not sure what question I would ask personally, but I'm thinking I might lob them this question and I really want to see what the parties would have to say, because I think this wouldn't be something they'd expect to be asked. I would ask them, would you have wanted the PPC to be present at this debate? And I would want to see how each of them respond to that if they don't avoid it altogether.
Probably dodge the question. Jagmeet Singh would say no, because he's made very clear he never wanted the PPC present for Maxime Bernier's views.
Yeah, but I'd be interested to see, because in some regards, I don't want to linger on this too long. I do think it's kind of funny how they're polling considerably higher, especially in the last day or so, than the Green Party, and they were excluded based on the fact that they weren't polling high enough. And I guess we are a democracy, so by that logic, I would expect at least one or two of the parties to say that they should be present. But regardless, I think that just about wraps it up. We could spend another hour talking about this. We almost spent half the debate talking about the debate. So if you listen to the debate and listen to us, thanks. If you listen to only us, I feel honored, and I think so do Drake and Yussef, right?
For sure. We could go on for hours, Yussef and I just bickering.
We really could.
I really managed to keep that to a minimum. Before we started recording, they spent at least 20 minutes fighting with the GST thing that O'Toole alluded to in his platform. But regardless, if you enjoyed this debate reaction, I'm glad you did. Please drop a like, drop a subscription, share it with your friends and family. I love all the support I can get. Our next video should be a debate reaction to the English language debate. So that should be coming out tomorrow. So if you want more election content from us or from a different group of me and some of my other friends, listen to that too. I think that should also be fun as well. So yeah, enjoy the night, enjoy the morning, enjoy whatever time you're listening to this, and
bye now.
Bye-bye.